All right, welcome back, everybody. And if you did not read the description or the title of this, I will just let you know this is a little bit of a different episode than my usual one. And so I'll give you a little bit of context behind this and why I'm doing this. So I was recently reached out to by a church to come speak on the future of tech, kind of where things are and how to think about all these different things. And so as I was putting my notes together, I thought, you know what, this is a really interesting topic, an important topic, and I think people would benefit from it. So I'm actually going to record this and push it out through my usual channels, even though it's a slightly different bend on things and it gives you a little bit more insight into who I am as an individual. So the one thing I will say right out of the gate is that I'm not going to get into all the specifics of the different technologies and all this other stuff. I actually designed this to be in partnership with a live Q&A component as well, where people could ask detailed questions about specific things. So if you listen to this thinking like, am I going to hear specific use cases and all of this? You're not. And again, if you want that, you can reach out to me. I'm happy to do this live and do some of the live Q&A, but this is just the kind of didactic connecting the dots part, not the other half of it. And the other thing I will say is, if you're listening to this and you don't share my biblical worldview, I think that's okay as well. I think you'll find very quickly that the goal of this is not to try and put points on the board or to convince you to come over to my side. But what I see often right now is a lot of people wrestling and struggling through the challenge of what feels like just constant uncertainty and things changing all the time. And so me wanting to connect the dots to how I firmly believe we can see how to navigate some of the treachery of advanced technology with wisdom that comes from an over 6,000-year-old manuscript, I think that can bring a sense of peace around the fact that, you know what, yes, things are changing, but also there's a lot of timeless wisdom that can help us navigate this. And so, like I said, whether you adhere to the same worldview as I do or not, I actually would encourage you to listen to it because I think you'll very quickly see like, oh, okay, there is something that I can walk away from with this. And I recognize where some of the allergy can come from this type of stuff, but I'd ask you to just kind of temper that and hear me out. Before I get into it, I want to give a little bit of context to who I am because some of you who listen to this may know me. Many of you probably don't, but I think this will set the stage for what we're going to get into. So if you follow any of my stuff, if you've Googled me or ChatGPT'd me or whatever, there's a lot of things you would probably find. You'd probably find, I'm the chief learning officer at ChenMed. I'm a tech analyst and advisor. I'm the host of Future Focused. I'm a LinkedIn influencer. I'm a husband and father of 7. Those are all notable things about me that are pretty publicly available. And they are true. They're true things about me. But I think one of the hard things I often find about this is that they really can tell a very specific kind of story about who I am and what my experience has been that is true but incomplete, I guess would be the best way I would say it. And I think that's true of all stereotypes is you can see something about someone and think you know what's going on and really you don't. And so I think it's also important for you to know that what you see on the internet isn't necessarily the whole part of me. I mean, I grew up in a very dysfunctional, abusive home. I struggled through college. I didn't grow up necessarily I guess I grew up in my later years in a air quote Christian home, but it was much more of a cultural Christian home where it was kind of more of a thing you did. And I wrestled with what I felt was the duality of this compartmentalization of this thing that supposedly was so transformative, yet it had this very neat box that it stayed in and didn't really play outside of that. And as a result of my childhood and all of this, I struggled with depression. It ultimately almost led to me taking my own life. But it's not like something that I go, oh yeah, that was the early version of me. And then I grew up and I no longer struggled. I mean, even as an adult, my marriage was almost destroyed in my early 30s by a porn addiction that my tech savviness had allowed to hide since I was very young. I still to this day, despite whatever public accolades I have or whatever growth I have, still struggle wrestling with this idea of, is anything I do really even going to matter? And so you might go, why on earth would you share this? What relevance does this have to the topic of what the Bible might have to say about advanced technology? But I think it actually very much sets the tone. And the reason I wanted to open with that is, as I look at where we are in this technological digital age, we are living in a more and more and more artificial world. And it's a world that tends to celebrate this idea that we all have it figured out. And if you don't, something's wrong with you, and you can't talk about your vulnerabilities and where you're struggling. And I just don't think that's healthy. My experience has been that is an exhausting existence to live in. And I truly believe what Paul says in 2 Corinthians when he says, when I am weak, that's actually when I'm strong. And so it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to model it and to say, I'm not just going to say, hey, you should be more vulnerable. We should be willing to talk about the bigger parts of us that not everybody knows about, but actually show what that can look like. I think the other part also comes from the fact that where I've arrived at some of these things and some of the hard things I've had to go through to actually look in the mirror and work through some of that stuff, it came with a lot of time and reflection and a lot of work that had to go into that. And I say that because it would be easy as you're trying to look at how do I navigate the chaos and the uncertainty of this and say, so then how do I navigate it? And see some of the things I'm going to talk about and go, okay, so if I just do this, it'll be okay. But I think I wouldn't be doing it justice if I told you that was the case, because the reality is you can know what you need to do, but if you can't look in the mirror and see who you really are and know the ins and outs of your own vulnerabilities and how things of your past and even your present affect you and change the way you think, you can know what the path is, but you're blind to who you are, so you won't know the path you're walking on. And so in addition to, I hope this content is beneficial. I hope it challenges your thinking. I hope it helps you navigate the future ahead. But I also want to be really honest with the fact that you also need to do some hard work to understand yourself. Because if you don't understand yourself, the scary part is the technology that is coming out that we have today probably knows you better than you know yourself. And that's why we see some of the things where you can sign up for a social media account and within minutes, it seems to be presenting you with content that you didn't even know you wanted. And it's because it knows you so well. And if you don't know yourself, you are exponentially more vulnerable to the things that we are seeing today and will only see more of in the future. So that's kind of the setting the stage for this whole thing. I want to transition out of that and kind of transition over to the biblical side of this and how the dots connect. Because what I'm going to do is kind of highlight how there's 4 risks that I think we see clearly laid out in the earliest chapters of Genesis that actually prepare us. If we see these risks, we know ourselves, we see these risks, we actually can do a much better job of mitigating what's ahead of us and the waters we're swimming in right now. But I think it's important to talk about this. And I also want to say, look, I'm not a theologian. I'm not an apologist. So I'm not going to sit and unpack what the Greek means or the Hebrew of Genesis means and what the different words are and how we should interpret those. I'm not going to get into this. Is this a 7-day creation? That's not the point. That's not what I want to talk about. And there's lots of resources you can go out if that's what you're looking for. I also want to let you know, my goal in this is not to tell you to put down your phone or get rid of your internet connection and hide from this stuff, because you can't. And I actually love tech. I think it's fantastic. I think there's so much beauty and wonder in what we can do with this, but we have to know what we're doing and we have to know how to navigate it. Now, you may be thinking, Genesis, like really all the way back to the beginning? Why on earth would you pick the early books of Genesis? And really the verses that I specifically am going to connect the dots to is Genesis 2:4 through Genesis 3:24. And to talk about this, and the reason for that, similar to the fact that I think before you can know what your path forward is, you need to actually look back into your past and see where you go. To me, the same is true with, if we're going to navigate the path forward through technology, we actually need to go back to the very beginning and look at what can be learned from that. It just helps us better prepare for things. And I just think of what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, which is, history repeats itself. It's all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new. And sometimes people say, here's something new, which we see right now. Here's something new. Look at this AI thing. Look at this AGI thing. Look at what we're doing with this. But it's old. Nothing is ever truly new. We don't remember what happened in the past. And in future generations, no one will remember what we're doing now. And so that sets the stage for why I think it's so important that we understand the past. We understand the patterns. We understand the history of what really has happened, so that we can say, well, okay, if that's what it is, and we know that truly history may not completely repeat itself, but it does rhyme, as Mark Twain, I think, famously said, then that can help us navigate it. So let's dive into what I think are the 4 biggest risks. And I want to be clear that I'm saying these are risks. Going back to the point that I'm not here to convince you that you should get rid of your phone or get rid of your internet connection. I mean, I don't know, maybe somebody will make that decision if it's the right one for them, but I certainly am not going to advocate for that, because ultimately I see these as risks. And I see the technology we see today and that's being developed for tomorrow as a tool. By itself, it's not really doing anything. It's simply accelerating and exacerbating what's already in play. And when I've been in conversations with people who say, well, no, actually the technology actually is bent towards a certain thing, it's trying to accomplish it, I actually go, well, the technology itself isn't. Somebody's behind that that's actually trying to set up the technology to achieve their will, achieve what they want, type of a thing. So the technology is just simply accomplishing it in new and different ways. And I think that's why it's so important that we understand these risks, because if we truly understand these risks, we can look at the technology and the things coming at us through a lens where we can quickly see, hey, wait a minute, this is playing on this vulnerability or this risk. So how am I going to make sure I navigate it well? Now, the first one is what I would call radical individualism. And this, going back to Genesis, goes back against God's design. And so when I look at it, I see in Genesis 2, he talks about, and again, my goal is not to make you go, okay, well, Christopher thinks this, so therefore, but it talks about this. God put the animals there. He did all this stuff. And it's not until Eve comes into the story that Adam finally goes, at last, bone from my bone, flesh from my flesh. So here he has all the animals around him. And it's great and it's fine. And I think about people who have dogs, dog people, cat people, they love their animals. But it's not until there's really this connection, this intimate connection between 2 human beings, where there's this like, aha, finally moment. And the technology we see today has the potential. Okay. It's not necessarily, unless we allow it, but it has the potential to completely separate us from that and completely isolate us from the intimacy that we actually need from one another. And I see it in 2 ways. I think in some ways, what I see happening regularly is it can take the relationships we have and make them extremely shallow. And just going back to this veneer that I think we see in a social media world, where we're all trying to create a media wrap of what our life really is, that's actually hiding what's underneath us, that can make it seem like we have deep connections, we have all these friends, and actually we don't know anybody and nobody really knows who we are. And we can have a completely connected life that is in many ways completely isolating. And the relationships we have are relationships that are built on partial truth or complete lies, which leads to really shallow, non-intimate relationships. And we know, going back to this, there's something there that isn't how we were designed. And I think whether you follow a biblical worldview or not, you know what I'm talking about in that moment where you have a true connection with another human being or another group of human beings. And it's why you see some of the things where people say in the corporate world, well, that's why we got to get together in person, because there's just something about it. There is something there about connecting with one another. And technology is really has the potential to isolate us from that. I think the other one that I see as Jennifer AI, generative AI continues to rise is this ability to go, I can do it all by myself. I don't need anyone else. And this can really lead to this radical individualism where you literally can go, I don't need friends. I can talk to AI. If I need to talk through something, I'll talk to AI. You know what? I used to go to this person to help me with this, but now I don't need to because I have the power of the internet with me and it has all the knowledge that has existed in the history of whatever. And we know that this doesn't go well. And going even just back to the text of Genesis 3, we see what happens when Eve doesn't call out to Adam when she's tempted with the fruit. We see, I mean, based on the text and the contextualization of it, it's not like Adam seems like he was all that far away. She doesn't ask for any help. And it leads to some really big mistakes. And I think we can see, I see the same thing in a corporate setting. I see the same thing in the world today where people are leaning on technology and going, I'm just making decisions because the AI data tells me this, or ChatGPT told me I should do this, or whatever. And instead of actually collecting and collaborating with other human beings, people find themselves in really disastrous situations that they could have completely avoided had they actually connected and collaborated with other people, which, if we look at the text this way, we know that this is how it was actually designed originally. And I just think of the proverb, fools think their own way is right, but wise listen to others. And I don't think listening to others is listening to ChatGPT. I think it can play a role. I think it can be helpful. But I think when we try and substitute artificial sweetener for the real thing, we're always going to come up short. And I think that's a real risk, one of the key risks that I see with the rise in advanced technology. Now, the second one that I am seeing in droves right now is how advanced technology has the potential to confuse our identities. And I think it's important what we can see from the text, if we go back to Genesis 2, and in this case, I'll jump back to Genesis 1, is that our identities are not something that we achieve because of the work we do or what we accomplish. And I think that's actually one of the really encouraging things that I take from the text when I feel unsettled about this is, if you look at Genesis 2, the Lord placed man in the garden to tend and watch over. I mean, he's basically given a responsibility, and it's not based on any performance he's done. It doesn't say in the text, like, and Adam really showed God how amazing he was at tending the fields. And God went, you know what? You're a hypo. I actually think this is now going to be your job because you really, before he even did it, he was given that. And I actually think Genesis 1, 26, 28 actually illustrates it even more clearly as he's talking about it. And it says, God created them in his own image. Like he created them with that purpose. And he told them, be fruitful, multiply, rule over the earth and govern it. He gave them a purpose. And again, it wasn't based on their performance. It wasn't based on their talents or their skills. And I think that's something that we need to see in some of this and go, well, wait a minute, what really is our identity? And another one that I think as I was going through and planning my notes on this is Jeremiah 1:5, where he says, I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb. Before you were born, I set you apart and appointed you as my prophet to the nations. And so again, it's this theme of identity doesn't come from performance and from the things we do. And that is a heavy weight that we carry often. And I see it in the corporate sphere all the time, where people are holding so tightly to the things that they do and the things that they've built their careers on, the things they've spent their time doing. And they go, but this is what my job, this is how I've built my life. This is how people know me. They know me to be this person that does this thing. And as the AI age is coming in, this is rocking people's worlds right now as things that people thought only I can do this. This is my jam. This is my thing. This can never be taken from me. They're having it ripped literally out from under them as AI comes in and goes, yeah, I can do that better, faster, whatever. And people are afraid of this technology because in many ways, I see people being afraid that their identities are being taken from them. And that's a real threat. And that can make you do really stupid things. As an example, I've seen people cling tightly to jobs they hated because their identity had become so intertwined with this is who I am. It's not just what I do, it's who I am. And the thought of that being taken from me leads them to making really bad decisions in their life. Now, on the flip side, I think another risk related to identity, when we don't lean into this, hey, identity is given to us. And actually, if we look at some of these things, ruling, reigning, taking responsibility for it, one of the biggest risks I see with advanced technology is we can actually become over dependent on it. And while, yeah, the opposite of that is being afraid that your identity is this stuff you do. And so you won't accept AI, you won't adopt it because you're afraid it's going to take who you are. You could be on the other side and not recognize, hey, but you've been given an identity of rule. And I say rulership carefully because I think a lot of people have a really negative view of what rulership is. And I think unless you truly understand the model of leadership and rulership Christ models for us, which is humility and serving others and things like that, you hear the word rulership and you think of dictatorship and domineering and things like that. And so when I say we have this identity of ruling over creation, ruling over things, it's not for our own gain to destroy, to, consume, things like that. But I think it's easy as we look at this advanced technology to go, oh, it's so capable, it's so competent. I'm just going to let it make the decisions. I don't need to oversee it. I don't need, and we can actually, in my opinion, let go of some of our God-given identities and hand it over to AI and go, you do it now. And I've seen that go sideways where people transition things that, like, literally, you just run this department AI, or you just make these decisions AI about who we hire or who we fire, and it makes catastrophic decisions. And then when it does, it's like, oh, well, that's not. And we know inherently that this makes us uncomfortable because when bad things happen and somebody tries to point the finger at AI, people don't just go, well, yeah, I guess AI. We go back to go, well, who allowed that decision? Who made that decision? Who enabled that to even happen? There's a demand for justice that, whether you adhere to a biblical worldview or not, we just feel it inside of us. And I think this is another risk, is that AI can make promises of, yeah, I'm perfectly capable of handling this, and you can just let me take this over. And I actually am seeing a rise in that. And so that's where I say I see these two polar opposites of our identities getting mixed up. On one end, we can identify ourselves with the things we do and not know how to navigate the future of tech. On the flip side, we can underestimate our responsibility and what our identity actually assigns us, and actually delegate and relegate things we shouldn't be doing. So the third one is these advanced technologies we have today, they will give you what you want. And that sounds good on the surface, but what we want is not inherently good. And I think that's something that is a really uncomfortable thing to start to wrestle with, is this idea that, hey, my desires, what I seek after just naturalistically, it's not for my good, and it's certainly not for the good of others. And ultimately it will destroy us. And I think that's one of the big risks I see with advanced technology, which, tying back to the text, we see this in Genesis 3:6. The woman was convinced. She saw the tree was beautiful and its fruit looked delicious, and she wanted it, and the wisdom it gave to her. She desired it. So she took it and ate it, and then gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it too. And I actually add that second part of he was with her and he ate it too, because I think one of the biggest tragedies that I often see is Eve takes a really bad rap on this. And historically, we have gone, Eve really is the one who screwed this whole thing up. Poor Adam was like the innocent victim. And I actually get really pissed off at Adam in this whole situation, because I'm actually convinced Adam wanted the fruit just as much as Eve did. Going back to my earlier point, I think he was right there with her. And I think he wanted it, and he threw her under the bus instead of actually, even, I would have had more respect for him if he ate the fruit, because at least then he would have gone for it. Instead, he leaves his wife to do it, and kind of like, well, are you going to die? And oh, you're not. Well, okay, then I guess I'll do it too. I think his heart was in the same place. I think he wanted it. And we see from the story that this does not end well. There are serious consequences that fall out of this. And you don't have to adhere to a biblical worldview to think of examples where people pursuing what they want ends poorly. And even if they try and say, well, I was trying to do a good thing, and sometimes you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. These things don't go well. And so, yeah, maybe my worldview would cause me to go a bit further with it. I think of Psalm 14:2-3, where God looks down on the entire human race and to see if anybody's wise and if anyone seeks God, and nobody, not a single one. Everyone's become corrupt. And so I think there's this tendency to want to go, well, but not me, not what I want. The things I want are actually really good. And advanced technology is going to fuel that. It's going to feed it. It's going to convince you that actually, if you just get what you want, if I can just give it to you faster, better, more efficiently, then you'll be satisfied. And the reality is, I've seen this play out way too many times, and it doesn't. And getting what you want will ultimately leave you completely unsatisfied, and in many cases lead to your ultimate destruction. And I think that's one of the most terrifying parts of this, is I see certain advancements in technology that they sound really good. And I can see where somebody would say, I mean, I want to do it. It's just for fun, or I actually want to help other people with all this stuff. And we can convince ourselves of some pretty ridiculous things. And AI is not going to go, hey, Christopher, I know what's really going on, and this isn't going to go well for you. As a dad of 7, just to the parents out there, okay, maybe you're still on the fence of how you're feeling about all this, but just think about your kids. Imagine if you gave your kids everything they ever wanted. How would they turn out? What kind of monsters would you have on your hands if every time they wanted something, you just gave it to them, no questions asked? You never, you want to go play in the street, go play in the street. You want to eat candy all day long? Fine. You don't want to go to bed? You want to do nothing but play video? Fine. It wouldn't go well for you. But the thing is that's exactly what AI is doing. That's exactly what these advanced technologies, it's not even just AI, it's other stuff. The metaverse, all of them are designed to go, whatever you want, we'll give it to you as quickly, as efficiently as we can possibly achieve. And I don't see this going well. And I think we need to be really, really mindful of it, because it will lead you to utter ruin. And I'm already starting to see some of that stuff happen in tragically large numbers. The fourth and kind of last one here that I think we just need to be really careful of is advanced tech. And it really kind of even ties to the previous point. But it's not only just that it'll give you what you want. It may actually even give you good things, but it's going to give you a cheap substitute or a false path to the things that God already promises us. And so looking at Genesis 3:6, they want wisdom. And we see that from the previous verse. The woman looks at it and it looks good, and she wants the wisdom that gets, which, if you are familiar with the biblical text, we know that Solomon is blessed for asking for wisdom. God tells us, if you want wisdom, I'll give it to you. So clearly this isn't an issue that God's not willing to give us wisdom, but there's something about the path by which we take to get it that matters. And basically in the story, the serpent challenges this and goes, yeah, I get God's doing it, but I think he's withholding from you. I think there's an easier way. There's an easier path to get here. Why don't you just eat it and get the wisdom instead of going through whatever path he just hasn't revealed to you yet? And isn't that kind of inconvenient that you don't know? Wouldn't it be a lot faster if you just did what you wanted? And yeah, it's a good thing. Wisdom's probably good. How on earth are you going to live if you don't have that kind of stuff? I can absolutely see where good things can quickly become bad things when we decide to take a path that isn't outlined for us. And We see this again in the New Testament where the accuser tries to pull the same trick on Jesus, takes him out into the wilderness, and actually offers him really good things, things that are good. Like, you need food. God says he's going to protect you. God's promised he's ultimately going to give his kingdom to you anyway. But why don't you just do it my way? Why don't you just do it this way? And I see this all the time with advanced technologies where they're offering shortcuts to stuff that you go, you, you can't shortcut that. Or getting this through this pathway. And here's a good example of this. I see this happening with the rise of like relationship bots and things like that, where it's like, oh, aren't human relationships really messy? Isn't it really kind of inconvenient to have that spouse who points out that you're not quite perfect and maybe challenges you to be the better version of yourself than you are today? And wouldn't it be so much easier if you just had an AI bot that only said what was wonderful about you and encouraged you and told you everything about how great you were and actually never challenged anything in you? I mean, on the surface, that sounds good. On the surface, it may seem like, well, isn't that really even in the Bible what it tells us we're going to get to at some point? At some point, we will achieve that through Christ. Like, isn't that what it gets to? So, well, why not skip a step here, maybe cut some corners along the way? And even just on a practical standpoint, I see this all the time in the corporate world where it's like, hey, we need to achieve XYZ revenue, or we need to reshift our workforce structure. Let's just go ahead and we need to hire. Here's a perfect example. We need to hire X number of new people into the organization. Let's just use AI to do it. And suddenly you find yourself in legal trouble, or you've hired a bunch of people who don't know what they're doing because AI has made these decisions. And ultimately what you were pursuing was a good thing, but you tried to take a different path. And this one I see rising faster and faster as we see rises in transhumanism promises. This promise of, hey, you won't get sick. Hey, we can prevent you from dying. There's a lot of this stuff where we go, well, yeah, but we're already promised that. But technology can say, yeah, but isn't the way that's promised? Didn't Jesus also tell you that it's going to be a tough road, that it's going to take time, and that wouldn't it be a lot easier if there's just a chip you could lean on and it will give you the same thing? And I think we just need to be really careful of that, because these technologies are going to try and deceive us. And we know, going all the way back, all four of these risks, going all the way back to the beginning of the story, they're not new. They've been fooling humanity for as long as we've been here. And I think as we step into the new age, as we step into the digital age where AI is very much a part of our everyday life, I think we need to be keenly aware of these risks so that as things present themselves, we can ask the question, hey, is this like making me more individualistic, more isolated than it should? Is this leading to me just going after what I want at any cost? Is this leading me to take shortcuts I shouldn't take? Is this leading me to hold tightly to things maybe I shouldn't hold tightly to, or maybe give up things that I shouldn't give up to? And I think if we really look at those key risks, we actually can navigate this in a much healthier way than we will if we don't. Now, the kind of closing transition that I want to highlight on this is one of the things that I am very open and transparent about is we have a tough road ahead. And that's not easy news. And even for my own journey of being a Christian, I know there were lots of times where I'm like, man, like, God, why'd you let the accuser in the garden? Why'd you let him in the first place? Why'd you put a tree? Why even present that? I've had to wrestle with that. And, I don't have answers for that. And I get asked things like that all the time, but we're told biblically that, hey, you're going to run into problems. That is not a hidden message. That is not a secret message of the Bible. And I think anybody just who's lived life knows there are no easy paths to things, but they come with purpose. And I think the two things that I find as encouragement through this is, even some days I'm just like, how is this all going to shake out? One comes from Isaiah 55, which when I don't get it, when I look at God and go, this doesn't make sense to me. How on earth, what are you doing? And in there it says, my thoughts are nothing like your thoughts, and my ways are far beyond anything you can imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. And so there is times where I just have to submit to myself to this humility of, I don't know. And this is really hard and it's really confusing. But my hope isn't in myself or the political system or other people. My hope is in something bigger than me, and something that says, hey, also, I'm doing this for purpose. And I think of Paul in Romans when he says we can rejoice when we run into problems, for we know they help us develop endurance, and endurance develops strength of character, and character, strength and confidence and hope of salvation. I just even think on a practical level, think of the wisdom that your parents gave you, or maybe your dad gave you as a kid, or some leader that you grew up with who you went through a hard thing. And on the surface, it seems like, couldn't this just have been avoided? And somebody said, yeah, but I needed you to learn this. I needed you to go through this so that you could come out stronger on the other side. And that is not fun when you're going through it. The number of things in my life that absolutely sucked to experience are countless. I highlighted a few in my intro. Believe me, you haven't seen 2% of some of the things that I've gone through. But it goes back to this idea that it's for a purpose. I think the other thing that is an encouragement as we go through this is, we are going to be tempted by these things. I highlight these risks not because if somehow you lock them in your head, you're going to know. I hope it gives you some sort of framework that the next time advanced tech presents something to you, you have some sort of framework to wrestle through and go, man, is this really going to be for my good in the end? But we know that God offers a way out. He tells us he does. And I just think about, what if, what if in the garden they had actually cried out to God? What if instead of just eating the fruit, they'd cried out? I I have no doubts God would have showed up real quick. But they have to choose that. They had to choose that, and they didn't. And I think for us, we're going to be presented with things that are way out of our league, and we're going to have to choose what we do with it. We're going to have to choose how we respond, and that's a choice we're going to have to make. I think the other thing is there are going to be some things that we just need to run from in this. And I don't have a comprehensive list. So I often get asked, are there just, what are the things you see that, you just say, we just shouldn't even do this with technology. This is something that should be completely kept off the table. And I don't have a universal list. I think there's a lot of nuance and complexity into that. I mean, there are some examples. I think, what I'm seeing with adult media, there's no redeeming quality of that. I think anytime we look at some of the things where we go, well, we're exploitation. I've talked recently a lot about exploitative practices companies use in training their AI, because there's people involved and they exploit real people to do this. And when I look at that, I go, there's not ever a time where you go, well, but the ends justify the means for some of these things. And I think about back to the story in Genesis. I really think, you know what, in that situation, they just should have run. I mean, God was in the garden with them. He should have just ran. They should have just ran to him. And I think there's going to be things that we're going to be faced with. And maybe it'll be different for you than it will for somebody else. Maybe there's going to be things you come across where you just need to flee and you just need to say, I need to get out of here. I don't want anything to do with this. And I just think of the wisdom in 2 Timothy, run from anything that stimulates youthful lusts and instead pursue righteous living, faithfulness, love, and peace. And there are going to be times where we're going to be presented with temptations and opportunities that we just need to say, I'm not even going to lean into it. I'm not even going to explore it. I'm just going to run. But and this goes back to my much earlier point, this is why it's so important you know yourself and you know the vulnerabilities you have inside you and the way your experience has shaped you. Because if you don't, you're not going to know when, hey, for your situation, you just need to run. Don't try and lean in or navigate or whatever, just go. But I think the final hope that I have and the encouragement I have to everybody is that, no matter how chaotic it gets, and there's some real chaos right now, there's some really, really terrifying things that I see on the horizon, is that ultimately God will be victorious over it. And this may be the part where if you don't share my worldview, maybe you'll say, well, I don't agree with that. And that's okay. That's okay. But I can say confidently that's where my hope comes from, is the fact that even if this whole AI thing just goes completely sideways and Skynet becomes a thing and the machines completely come and wipe us off the face of the planet, my hope is not in this. And I see that going all the way back to Genesis 3. And you might go, what? What are you talking about? But even in Genesis 3 and verse 15, and I will cause hostility between you and the woman and between your offspring and her offspring, and he will strike your head and you will strike his heel. There is a promise that in the end, God will win. He will defeat all of this. And so we see that again throughout all the Old Testament, in Isaiah, in Ezekiel, and Daniel, and Malachi. We ultimately see this in that, to me, is the hope of Christ's resurrection, is the hope of, hey, like death isn't the end. I think that's really the true hope in this. You think that's the end? It's not. I'll defeat even that, this thing that seems impossible. And I think that's such an encouraging message. And if you go all the way to Revelation 21, we see that in the end, he wins. And so if you don't hold to that, you know what? That's not for me to decide. But I can tell you right now, that is very much the hope that I hold to. And if you hold to a similar worldview, I would encourage you in that, because it is going to get scary and it is going to get overwhelming. And there are going to be some things that feel like, how is this all going to shake out? And um, I don't know the answers. And there's going to be lots of times where I'm going to look at it and go, well, I think it should happen differently. I think it should go like this. And that's where I'm going to continue to lean back on them. My thoughts are nothing like your thoughts. My ways are beyond anything you can imagine. So with that, I hope this at least encouraged, challenged, gave you some additional food for thought. Like I said, if whether you're a Christian or not, I would highly encourage you to go back and read Genesis 2:4 through 3:24. You may read it through a different set of eyes that you maybe haven't before. And again, even if you don't share my whole worldview, you may go, wow, there's actually some pretty interesting stuff in a 6,000 plus year old scroll that I hadn't really considered, in how that connects to the world we're living today. Because quite frankly, I think there's a lot more to be said about the future ahead than we often realize. So with that, I hope this challenged your thinking. I hope it encouraged you. I hope you found it helpful. I will see you on the other side. And like I said, normally I do this with a live Q&A session so that people have a chance to go, well, what about this? Or what about this situation? How are you thinking about these things? And I can't do that here on any level, but you can send me a message. You can reach out, and I'm happy to talk about this whenever possible. So with that, I hope you have a great week, and we will see you on the other side.